I thought I knew Tom pretty well. He owned a country inn with a pub in rural New England. He seemed to love people, for he was always at the bar or dining room, smiling, laughing and joking. He adored his inn and pub, and seemed happiest here. After all, who wouldn't be happy to be in a warm and cozy inn where you are welcomed like a long-lost friend who escaped the cold? His inn and pub, known in town as the Lucky Monk's Den, reflected his character. Tom was a devout Catholic and went to Mass daily. Sometimes, during the quiet hours, he could be seen sitting in his favorite chair in front of the fireplace, praying with rosary beads in his hands. Although he did not utter a word, his gaze fixed on the fire gave away that his thoughts were occupied with something important. Occasionally a lone tear rolled down his cheek, but when he spoke to him, he was instantly transformed, regaining his usual smile. Tom lived on the outskirts of town on a 5-acre farm that he managed himself with the help of a few tenants. Groceries and livestock from the farm provided the pub, and for guests he prepared the traditional New England dishes he had grown up on: Yankee stew, chicken and turkey pies, brook trout, and Indian pudding for dessert. When guests were seated, he always served a tray of crackers and cottage cheese. At first glance, Tom did not appear to be a man of secrets. He was married and childless, but respected in the community. He came to town shortly after World War I and began working as a cook at the local hot grill restaurant. Saving every penny he earned, he saved enough in 10 years to buy a farm and take up farming. People missed his cooking at the hot grill, especially at breakfast and lunchtime, and began visiting him at the farm. Soon he was hosting guests, and after saving some more money, he bought the local mill by the mill pond, renovated it and turned it into an inn and pub that became his pride. Over time, the inn and pub became so popular that in the summer and fall there were often not enough seats, and the line for the pub stretched a mile around the block. Eventually, Tom hired a woman named Lovra, who complemented his cooking skills perfectly with her dishes. The Lucky Monk's Den became a home away from home for many, and people sought to go there even during the holidays when Tom threw Thanksgiving and Christmas parties expressing gratitude for his success. Tom seemed like a man who could not be suspected of hiding secrets. One day a mysterious stranger came to town. Tall, with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a scar on his face, he walked into the Happy Monk's Den and asked for Tom. When Tom saw the stranger, his face turned white, and for the first time, I noticed fear in his eyes. The stranger smiled and said something in a foreign language, but Tom just looked at him, shrugging his shoulders as if he didn't understand a word. The fear was still evident on his face. The stranger spoke in the foreign language again, and Tom replied, "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. We have no rooms available," and grabbing the stranger's suitcase, carried it out the front door. It was the first time I'd seen Tom less hospitable than usual. The stranger looked up and in broken English said, "After all we've been through, I thought you'd be glad to see me, but it seems I was mistaken." "I don't know what you're talking about," Tom replied. "Please go away and never come back." And with these words the stranger left without another word. In the evening Tom sat in his chair before the fireplace, as usual, with a cold stare, nervously going over the rosary in his fingers. I asked him if everything was all right, and he tried to smile, but I realized at once that the smile was fake. There were tears in his eyes that made them dark and empty. They were tears of fear, as if some terrible secret was about to be revealed. In the mornings I saw Tom at Mass, but he was always on his knees, as if he were begging God to lighten the burden pressing on his shoulders. His hands trembled, and when he approached communion, it looked as if he could barely stand on his feet. One day Lovra came up to me terrified and wanted to talk. I asked what was wrong. It turned out that Tom had locked himself in the bathroom and started screaming at the top of his lungs. When he came out, he seemed agitated about something and, then suddenly started smashing plates on the floor. Later that day, I went to see Tom and asked what was wrong. "It's all right," he replied briefly. "I'm fine, leave me alone." And with those words, he drove out of the hotel and into his car. I followed Tom to his farmhouse and saw a blonde-haired, blue-eyed stranger coming into the inn. I crept up to the main house trying not to be seen. Inside, there was a lot of shouting in a language I didn't understand, with Tom being the main one shouting. It surprised me that Tom was speaking in a language that was not English. Suddenly I heard gunshots, and then there was complete silence. That was the last time I saw the stranger, and there was no further mention of him. The next day, I went up to Tom and said, "You know you can talk to me about anything." I never found out what the shots were, although I had my suspicions. But I never discussed the subject with Tom. Years passed. Tom, once an energetic young man, had evolved into a more serious middle-aged man. After the mysterious stranger's visit, he became more wary of people and began to drink more than before. As time went on, he began to need help around the house, and he hired a maid named Hilda, who also helped out at the cafe. Hilda was from Germany, and I often asked her about Tom. She told me that sometimes he would scream in German in his sleep, as if he were having nightmares, and then wake up in a cold sweat. He would go downstairs and drink a glass of undiluted whiskey, which seemed to calm his nerves. The next morning Hilda would find sweat-soaked sheets in his bedroom. One day I approached Tom and asked how he was doing, mentioning, "I didn't know you spoke German." In response, he shouted, "I don't believe it," and with those words threw me out of the hotel. Hilda looked at me with concern, and I realized that Tom was hiding something. Later that day, Hilda found me in the office and asked me to forget what she had told me. I asked her, "What secret is Tom desperately trying to hide?" She replied, "It's not my place to tell." It was clear that Hilda was aware of the terrible secret Tom was trying to hide, but to her credit, she respected his desire to keep it a secret. As the years passed, Tom became increasingly withdrawn, to the point where he was rarely seen in town. He mostly lived alone on the farm, only occasionally dropping by the inn to check on things. The inn remained popular, especially in the fall when the leaves were falling. Tom expanded it to accommodate more tourists who came to town to enjoy the fall colors. One day an elderly Jewish couple, the Morschilder couple, came to town. They were a wonderful couple, and I got to know them well. Having survived the Holocaust, they had immigrated to the United States where they met, married and had children. They had previously been married and had families in Europe, but lost them in the Holocaust. They had to pick up the pieces of their lives, but fortunately they were young enough to start a new family. They were pleasant conversationalists and seemed to have gotten over the trauma, although the pain of losing their relatives still lived within them. One day Tom came into the hotel and sat in his usual chair in front of the fireplace, quiet and pensive. Suddenly I noticed Mr. Morschilder turn pale, as if he had seen a ghost from his past. He apologized and went into the bathroom briefly. Mrs. Morschilder seemed puzzled, having never seen her husband like this before. When Mr. Morschilder returned, he sat down next to Tom on the sofa in front of the fireplace. He looked at Tom intently, as if reliving a memory he did not wish to recall. Then Mr. Morschilder spoke to Tom in German, and as their gazes met it was evident that they had known each other before. "I don't speak German," said Tom, but Mr. Morschilder went on. Both men were trembling, and had ghostly expressions on their faces, as if they were reliving a painful memory. At that moment I realized what a terrible secret Tom had been hiding all these years. Mr. Morschilder did not stop pressing Tom in German until he could not stand it any longer and shouted something back in the same language. Silence reigned in the room. The next day the Morschilder couple left town, never to return again, but it became known that Tom spoke German. No one could understand why he was arguing with Mr. Morshoulder. I tried to talk to Tom about it, but he shut up and retreated to his farm, never coming out again. Hilda begged me, don't press him about his past. He doesn't want to talk about it. Several months passed before strangers came to town, FBI agents from Washington, D.C. Soon they found their way to the hotel. "Good morning," one of the agents said. "We're looking for a man named Sigmund Mortbacher." The woman at the front desk shook her head. "There's no one here by that name." Then the agent pulled a picture out of his pocket and showed it to her. It showed a young Tom in a World War SS uniform. "Mr. Mortbacher is charged with war crimes and lying about his past when applying for citizenship." I walked up to the agent and said, "I know where he lives." The agents could not reveal details, but said they had gotten the information from an anonymous source who claimed Tom was a Nazi and participated in the Holocaust. We went to the door of Tom's house and knocked, but got no answer. The agents knocked again, louder this time, and shouted, "Mr. Mortbacher, we have a warrant for your arrest for war crimes." There was no response. Finally, the door was opened by Hilda. "Where's Tom?" I asked. "He's locked himself in the basement," she replied. The agents rushed into the house and headed for the basement, but they couldn't get the door open. I suggested they step back and let me talk to Tom. They agreed and stepped outside. I knocked on the basement door. "Tom, let me in. I want to help." There was no answer. "Tom, please let me help." Hilda said something in German, and although I didn't understand the words, it caused Tom to have a fit of inconsolable sobs. We brought in a Catholic priest to persuade Tom to open the door, but he refused. The sobs grew louder and louder. Finally, we heard Tom's weak voice, mein Gott, warum hast du mich verlassen?" And then a shot rang out. We broke down the door and saw Tom lying in a pool of blood with a gunshot wound to the head. He was wearing an SS uniform, and the gun was still in his hand. Tom had killed himself. FBI agents broke into the basement and discovered a collection of Nazi memorabilia, including a bust of Adolf Hitler. An investigation team arrived, finding boxes of documents Tom had hidden all these years detailing Nazi crimes. In one of the boxes, I saw a picture of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man who had once come to town, also wearing a Nazi uniform. I told the agents about him and the gunshots I heard that night. The dogs had found a shallow grave in a field where the man had been buried with a bullet wound to the head. The news traveled all over town. Tom was a Nazi in hiding, and justice had finally caught up with him. The inn, pub and farm were seized by the government and sold. The proceeds went to a Holocaust relief fund, and all the documents went to the archives for further study. Tom's body was cremated and the ashes scattered in the ocean so as not to become a place of worship for neo-Nazis. Tom's name was no longer mentioned in the town. Hilda was gone, too, and was never heard from again. Many years later, a thick fog descended over the town, the densest fog I had ever seen. I was at the Tom Holiday Inn, which had been sold to a new family. I was sitting by the fireplace next to the chair where Tom usually sat. Suddenly there was screaming outside and the sound of chains dragging on the ground. A mist had entered through the closed door. The lights went out and the flames in the fireplace turned blue. I turned toward the source of the sound and saw a ghost sitting in Tom's chair. It was Tom, in a Nazi uniform and chained, with a gunshot wound on his head. He looked at me with a deep sad look and then vanished into thin air. The light returned and the flames returned to normal, but the memory of Tom's ghost remained in my mind. For the rest of my life, I heard the wailing and clinking of chains, and Tom haunted me in my dreams. I saw his face everywhere. His story and his fate still haunt me to this day.